TFA fam, hope you're all doing well. Appreciate you rocking with us. We're going to jump into the first look at week 14 waivers. We do have another apocalypse coming up in week 14 because why the hell not? Why wouldn't you just sandwich 12 teams on bye in the past 3 weeks? But if you were looking to get into the playoffs and you were in need of having anyone from the Ravens, Broncos, Texans, Colts, Pats, or Commanders, apparently Goodell in the NFL said that is too bad, so sad. So here to help you out with that, Kev, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive right into it. Let's talk about the quarterback streaming options for week 14 ahead of the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, first thing, let's start with Caleb Williams. They get the matchup against the 49ers. He's rostered in 54% of Yahoo leagues, but only 34% of ESPN leagues. Since firing Shane Waldron, Caleb Williams and the Bears have been on an absolute tear. Williams has scored 26 fantasy points in back-to-back weeks while averaging over 300 passing yards and 2.5 passing touchdowns and 30-plus rushing yards per game. While the 49ers aren't necessarily the best matchup for Williams, it's pretty similar to the one he just faced against the Lions, making him, in my mind, the best streaming option of the week. Next up is Russell Wilson. I mean, he had an absolute explosion game today, completing 29 of 38 for 414 yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 INT for 28 fantasy points against the reeling Bengals. In his 6 games that Wilson has started, he has 3 games with 20-plus fantasy points. Next up for the Steelers, a rematch for the Week 12 game against the Browns. Wilson threw for 270 yards and a score in that game. Since Week 8, the Browns have yielded 270 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and a 112.1 passer rating, which is the 5th highest rate in the league. This is sets up as a really solid matchup for Russell Wilson. So I think he is another really solid streaming option again this week. Derek Carr. This is more of a necessity than anything. But I will say it's kind of wild that Derek Carr has played as well as he has with so many weapons out. Today against the Rams, Carr completed 24 of 37 for 184 yards and a score for 15 fantasy points. While it obviously wasn't a banner day, he has scored 21, 19, and 15 fantasy points in each of his last 3 games. Next up, though, is a matchup against the Giants, who have allowed the 16th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Now, I will mention, I mean, just the hits keep on coming. And Taysom Hill now looks like he suffered a season-ending knee injury, and it looks like he is done for the year. So Alvin Kamara may see 36 targets in this upcoming game. It's just absolutely wild. As many injuries this team has suffered to their playmakers. And, credit to Derek Carr, who's actually still played pretty well for the most part, all things considered. So I think you could look at Derek Carr. Next up is Jameis Winston. Winston is always in play because of the gunslinger mentality. It has 4 starts this year. Winston has thrown the ball 40-plus times in 3 of them. This obviously isn't a great matchup against the Steelers, but we have seen this Steelers pass defense stumble at times in recent weeks. And we saw Winston, I think he put up around 15, 16 fantasy points the last time these 2 teams played in the Snow Globe game. So I think Winston at least is a decent option. And the other one, Will Levis. And I get it. I really do. It kind of makes you feel like you want to throw open your mouth a little bit whenever you say this. But I will say this. He has actually not been bad in recent weeks. And honestly, I had Trevor Lawrence on this list. And I was going to go with him as an option. But he got absolutely demolished by Al-Shahir in that game, and an absolute dirty hit. And he is likely not going to play next week. So I pivoted over to Levis, and for fantasy purposes, he has been rather consistent in the last 4 games, scoring 21, 17, 20, and 20 fantasy points the last 4 games, and has thrown 2 passing touchdowns in 3 of the last 4 games as well. So this is a good matchup. The Jags have allowed the most fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. So while I get it, it's not sexy, it's not exciting. Will Levis, I definitely think you could take a look at there if he's available. Now, there's a couple other quarterbacks that were rostered just over 60%, so I didn't want to really name them. If any of those guys are sitting out there, I don't mind taking a look at some of them either. Like guys like Geno Smith against the Cardinals, I think you could look there. He's rostered in over 60% of leagues, and a couple other options there. So I just figured most of those guys are taken.
Going to move it over to the Week 14 waiver ads at running back. Obviously, we have to lead things off with the 49ers backfield. I was typing this up. This was looking like it was going to be another quiet week. And as I was doing it, have the game on in the background, obviously, and then I saw McCaffrey give himself up on that play. limp off. Now we're getting the word that he has suffered a knee injury. He was pretty quickly ruled out. We still don't have any like confirmation on exactly what's going on or how long to expect him out. But, with the 49ers slipping further and further away from playoff contention, wouldn't be surprising to see him shut down at some point. Obviously, like I said, we don't know what's going to happen next week. But Jordan Mason and Isaac Guerrero would obviously lead the way here. Mason is rostered in about 40% of ESPN leagues. Isaac Guerrero is more widely available. I will say Mason looks pretty good right now, has ripped off a couple of bigger runs, but that hasn't necessarily been his MO, especially toward the tail end of whenever CMC was returning. Looked like Guerrero was the more explosive back. So whichever one's available, I would definitely be going out there to add either of them. Jerry McNichols is going to be next up. I faded Brian Robinson today. That was obviously not the right call. But I'd still imagine McNichols will be involved coming out of the bye with Eckler placed on IR. We saw Chris Rodriguez put up a really big day, but he was only involved after this game was completely out of hand. He only played 2 snaps in the first 3 quarters, and obviously that game was well put away by that time. So if you're checking the box scores here and you see Chris Rodriguez, 90 plus yards and a touchdown, I would not be chasing that unless you're like in a super deep league, because he just was not involved until, like I said, until the fourth quarter. I think he got every touch in the fourth when that game was put away. So Jerry McNichols would still be the guy that I would want there. Kamani Vidal, Gus Edwards led the way for the Chargers with 6 carries. Vidal was right behind him with 4, only 1 for Hassan Haskins, and that came on a fumble. So I think that's why we saw him with a limited involvement. Edwards ran 6 more routes, so you'd hope to see Vidal get more involved there to really have fantasy value going forward, but you can look there nonetheless. Tank Bigsby, still pretty widely available in ESPN leagues, so I just want to throw him on here. Not as an exciting of an option because you have to see a positive game script for the Jags to really feel good about putting Bigsby in your lineup. But they do have the Jets and the Raiders after the Titans this week, so there are some decent spots ahead. Didn't put him on the list, but I will throw out Sincere McCormick. I'm going to have to see what happens with Zamir White and Alexander Madison, but McCormick has looked pretty solid over the past 2 weeks. Had a pretty decent day against a tough Chiefs run defense on the Friday game. Would have a solid matchup against the Bucs in Week 14 if he would get involved again in this game. But again, that's going to really come down to what happens with the other running backs in front of him. Outside of that, it's just going to be another week to just be plugging these handcuff running backs in like we've been talking about for the past few weeks. Stash these guys ahead of time so you don't have to be scrambling to the waiver wire if something like that happens. I did just want to mention Tyler Algier. He is now available in 60% of ESPN leagues. So, more competitive leagues, 12-team leagues, probably not available, but it's definitely worth checking out to see if he's sitting out there, because he's for sure one of the most valuable handcuffs in fantasy. Other than that, it's going to be the names we've been mentioning here a ton. Braylon Allen, Jalen Wright, Blake Corum. Definitely want to get Corum on my roster if he's sitting out there. Ray Davis, Cam Akers, Trey Benson. We did see Amari DiMercato have more involvement today, so I think if James Conner were to go down, that would be more of a split. Jerome Ford, Khalil Herbert, Roshan Johnson, Antonio Gibson back in the fold, Justice Hill, and then Kenny Gainwell / Will Shipley. I think that would be a split if anything were to happen to Saquon.
Yeah, moving over to wide receivers, I think that it's pretty obvious the number one name on this list is going to be Adam Thielen, who had himself a really solid game in the second game back from injury. He hauled in 8 of 10 targets for 99 yards and a score. He actually had what would have been a second touchdown overturned earlier in the game, but which would have been a monster day for him. But either way, there's no denying how good Thielen looks. And with Bryce Young playing so well, Thielen should be viewed as a viable wide receiver 3 on most weeks, and he is a must-add in all formats. And just to mention, Bryce Young might have made this list as a streaming option this week, but they are playing the Eagles, and that is not a matchup that I feel great about, as the Eagles' defense has absolutely looked elite all year. So don't really love that. But in future weeks after that, I definitely think that Bryce Young is starting to be more and more of a streamer option. So love to see it for him to bounce back the way that he has since he was benched earlier in the year. He really has done him wonders. He looks way more confident of a player. So next up is Parker Washington. In the Jags' first game back from bye, we saw Parker Washington lead everyone with 12 targets. While they weren't the most accurate targets, he did haul in 6 of them for 102 yards and a score for 24 fantasy points, with Gabe Davis and Christian Kirk done for the year. There should be plenty of opportunities for the Penn State great wide receiver. They have matchups against the Titans, Jets, Raiders, and Titans again to close out the season. Washington should have some flex appeal moving forward. Not as excited about him this week without likely Trevor Lawrence, but I think over the final 3 weeks when Trevor Lawrence returns, I do think Parker Washington could be kind of an interesting flex play. Nick Westbrook-Akine, he's just inevitable at this point. The legend of NWI continues to grow as he now has scored 8 touchdowns in the last 8 games. In fact, 8 of his total 20 receptions are touchdowns. So that's exciting. And today he was targeted 8 times. I guess he's just the lucky number 8. He secured 3 of them for 61 yards and 2 scores. He's now scored 12 or more PPR points in 5 of his last 6 games. And he has started to see more targets recently, seeing 20 targets over his last 3 games as well. So I do think Nick Westbrook-Akine, as he gets more involved within this offense, and it's not just the touchdowns, I think he becomes a little bit more viable of an option. So I wanted to add him on here. Brandon Cooks rostered 10% of leagues in his return. He didn't have a huge yardage day, but he did score a short touchdown. He was targeted 7 times. It should continue to have opportunities moving forward as the Cowboys' number 2 wide receiver. Next up is a really good matchup against just one of the worst defenses in the league in the Bengals. He should be viewed as a wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5. I get it's with Cooper Rush, but Cooper Rush has been like okay, in his opportunities since coming back. I've seen some people already kind of mentioning the Bengals as a streaming option. No, thank you on that. I want no part of any of that defense. That defense has just been absolutely dreadful for most of the season, and I just don't really want any part of that. So I would not be interested in streaming the Bengals. But the other couple guys I put on here, Elijah Moore, Devon Bailey, obviously those guys haven't played yet. But I think both of them are really viable streaming, are viable options in 12-team leagues. Definitely those guys should not be sitting out in the amount of leagues they are because of the amount of opportunities they see, especially like Elijah Moore for an offense that that throws it roughly 40 times a game, like we've seen. There's plenty of targets to go around for the pass catchers. So the other one is MVS, much like NWI. Just continue to score touchdowns. Score another one today. Doesn't see a lot of targets, but not a lot there. He could continue to see more targets because right now there's just not a lot there in that wide receiver room or in terms of overall weapons outside of him and Alvin Kamara at this point. So other ones on here are Ray McLeod. He did have 95 yards save. He's a little more boom or bust, kind of a wide receiver 5 type option. Keon Coleman obviously missed again today, but he should be nearing a return. Once he does, I think he's a viable option. He was starting to really come on before he got hurt. Demario Douglas is just a PPR option. Joshua Palmer is more of a desperation play, but with so many teams on bye, you could look at somebody like Joshua Palmer, who's gotten plenty of opportunities, just hasn't really quite connected, especially over the last couple of weeks where the Chargers offense, especially their passing offense, has kind of taken a step back from what they were doing. So, and then Alec Pierce, I think, is an option you could look at. Now, I put Hollywood Brown in here. If what Ian Rapsheet's reporting, then you don't even need to worry about Hollywood Brown. You could wipe him off because basically it's being reported that he's supposed to go see a doctor in week 15, return to practice in week 16. He won't play. The Chiefs are so ultra conservative with the way they do stuff. There's no shot. At the best shot he'll play is week 18. Because some of the initial reporting was he was going to return to practice this week or possibly next at worst. But if he's not going to return until week 16 to practice, at best he might play a couple of snaps week 17. But considering he's been out the entire season, has not practiced, has done anything, I find it very, very hard to believe that he's going to do much of anything until the playoffs.
I will say, depending on what we hear from Ladd McConkey, picked up a knee injury toward the end of the game. I think that would put Josh Palmer in the ads section. So that's just something that should be paying attention to if you do need some wide receiver help this coming week. Moving over to the tight end streams to wrap this up and finish this out. Going to kick it off with Will Dissly. It was a super disappointing performance today, obviously, who gave you a goose egg. Don't worry, Kevin, I feel and share your pain. We both started him in a bunch of places. Only had 1 target. Like I said, no catches. But this would be a pretty solid bounce back spot going up against KC, who has struggled against tight ends for the majority of the season. And again, like I said, especially if Ladd McConkey would potentially miss this game. So we have no indication of what may or may not happen with that. But if he were to miss, that would obviously open up a bunch of targets for Will Dissly. Tommy Tremble, this depends on the availability of Jatavian Sanders. If Sanders sits again, Tremble's a really nice streaming option. We saw him put up 5 for 77 today, thanks to basically playing all of the snaps at tight end. Was tied for a third in targets for Carolina. But again, we're going to have to see what happens with Sanders first. I would imagine if he's here, that would end up being more of a split. Both of those guys have played pretty well. Dawson Knox, this one again is dependent on another tight end, but Dalton Kincaid obviously missed the game with his knee injury. The Bills get the Rams, who have allowed the 10th most fantasy points per game to the position. Kev, you touched on it with Taysom Hill going down with what looks like a season-ending knee injury. That would open things up for Juwan Johnson and Foster Moreau. I lean Juwan Johnson. He was the one who did have some more usage this week. But we've seen this before when Taysom Hill was out. There wasn't really a guy who stepped forward. But Juwan Johnson did run 31 routes today to just 19 for Moreau. Had out-targeted him 7-4. Like I said, I wouldn't be surprised to see this be closer next week given their lack of weapons. And then somebody that I did not put on the list but to pay attention to, again, depending on what happens here, would be Grant Calcaterra. Dallas Goedert picked up some sort of knee injury. I couldn't really find anything definitive on it or exactly what happened. But if he's out and Devonta Smith misses again, you could look at Calcaterra if you miss out on any of these other tight ends I mentioned.
I think one other option that wasn't on there that you could look at, which seems thin, but I don't hate it, is Noah Gray. He has actually been playing roughly 50 to 60% of the snaps, running a lot of routes recently as well. So, I mean, he saw another 6 targets this week, 4 for 58 for him, didn't find the end zone. But as much as they're utilizing him, they're running a ton of 12 and 13 personnel for the Chiefs, which some of they need to because their offensive tackles are just wide open. You just run right by him, just put a hand on him and go right by him. But some of it, too, is conserving Travis Kelce as well. They use Travis Kelce in ways as like a decoy to allow Noah Gray to get open. So I do think Noah Gray, at the very least, especially with 6 teams on bye this week, I think is definitely somebody you could take a look at to get a matchup against the Chargers, which isn't a terrible matchup. So with so much focus on Travis Kelce, you tend to see a lot more for Noah Gray. So I do think Noah Gray is also a viable streaming option for this week.
Yeah, I like that call. I had to start him during the Bipocalypse 2 weeks ago, and that was his 2 touchdown game. So certainly worse options out there.
Yeah. So that being said, I think that pretty much wraps up. I don't see any questions in the comments. So that being said, I guess hopefully we don't have any more injuries. It really wasn't a terrible injury week for the most part overall. You definitely lost some players here, but you'll have to wait and see for the Monday night game as well. This last half between the Browns and the Broncos. But other than that, looks like a pretty straightforward streaming week. But it is going to be a lot tougher with so many teams on bye. All these teams probably fighting to get into the playoffs. So you have to get some creativeness. So if you have any questions, leave in the comment section below, and we will make sure we get to them and get you set up for this week. We'll be back in with all of our week 14 content as well in the short order. So have a good rest of the week. Have a good week, and we'll see you on the next one.